as we think about helping students develop their knowledge related to identification of shapes, there's some common learning trajectories that we might think about. So when students are in preschool, pre-kindergarten, kindergarten, they're probably around 4 to 6 years old. And in this time, they are recognizing shapes in their environment and then thinking about the attributes of shapes, such as this shape has 3 sides. And they're often asked to identify shapes. That shape, this shape right here, is a rectangle. As students move into first grade when they're approximately 6, 7 years old, they should be able to identify shapes by their components. They should be able to place objects on top of each other to determine shape congruence, whether shapes are the same or different. And they should be able to construct shapes from different parts. We'll get into that in section 2. And then finally, as we move to second grade, students are now 7, 8, 9 years old. They should be able to represent various angles, sort shapes based on properties, and identify the properties of shapes. Now, all students may not follow this sequence exactly, but you can see here we're going from easier shape understanding to more difficult. Now, as we think about how do we help students with this, we've got shapes everywhere around us. I'm in a room where I look around and I see dozens, if probably not hundreds of shapes. There's shapes on the ceiling and shapes on the floor, shapes all around me. You're probably also in a room. Take a look around. What are some of the shapes that you see? You might not be thinking about that on a daily basis, but your students should be encouraged to think about all the shapes that are around them in school, in their home, or even if I went to this park and I visited this park on a nice day, what are some of the shapes that I see? So one of the initial activities we can do with shapes is just ask students to point out different things and then start to talk about these shapes and give these shapes names. For example, here I see this park bench, and I see that this park bench has rectangles that help construct the back of the bench and likely the bottom of the bench. What are some of the other shapes that you see in your environment? Now, not only do we want to talk about the formal names of shapes, such as rectangles, circles, squares, and so on, we also want to help students understand where is their place in their environment and how do shapes relate to that. So for example, maybe I am standing right now beside this bench. Maybe if I ducked down a lot like this, I am under the bench. Or maybe if I climbed on top of it, I'm on top of the bench. So besides that formal language of the shapes, we have a lot of that spatial language, or sometimes it's called positional language, and you can see some other examples right over here on this slide. But that language is also important for students to understand how they relate to things in the environment around them. So you can read all of the examples here, but maybe we say, on our walk to the park, let's identify all the rectangles that we see and call out when you see a rectangle. And students would probably see a lot more rectangles than you may have ever expected. Then as we do that, we want to start to name shapes. I talked a little bit about this, but this whole slide is about naming shapes. And so we have common names for shapes, such as circles, triangles, rectangles, squares, and so on. Students should be able to look around their environment and identify some of the different shapes. They should also be able to look at different manipulatives or drawings and identify the different shapes. For example, here I see that the blue shapes are triangles and the red shapes are circles. Now, it shouldn't depend upon the size or the color. Students should be able to still recognize a triangle as a triangle if it's blue or green or if it's patterned. All right, so really thinking about we should identify these shapes regardless of other attributes, particularly size. Then as we move from understanding the fundamentals of these shapes, beyond just naming them, we want students to be able to recognize shapes and to be able to draw shapes. We're going to look at our manipulatives in just a minute, where we may ask students to actually construct shapes with some of our manipulatives. But drawing is a good idea, but sometimes with drawing, especially with our little hands, sometimes our shape drawing might not be that precise. That's okay. As students develop better fine motor skill, they'll be more precise with their shape drawings. So here on this activity, I'm thinking about how helping students identify closed shapes with 3 sides. And so here I would ask them to circle all of the closed shapes with 3 sides. So here I'm recognizing those shapes and identifying them. And then as we work with our shapes, we also want to think about our solids, or I often call these figures. So we have flats and solids, or shapes and figures. But students should be able to think about, well, I've got 2-dimensional shapes and 3-dimensional figures, and understand that there's a difference between these shapes and figures, and there's also a lot of similarities here. So in this example, you can see I've got a figure, but actually if I make a shadow, then it ends up being 2-dimensional. So we can show our 3-dimensional figures as 2-dimensional shapes. And I'll show a few examples of this with my manipulatives. So a few things from this slide. Students can explore 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional shapes using shadows. And they can also do this with little feeling boards or other hands-on materials that you can find in your environment. So let's get into those shapes and figures, and let's look at some hands-on tools we can use to help students understand different shapes and figures. All right, let's first talk about 2-dimensional shapes. There's a lot of different manipulatives that you might use to help students identify and recognize these 2-dimensional shapes. I have these attribute blocks. I'll kind of scoot them over here. Probably a lot of you have those in your early grades classroom. We also have the pattern blocks. I have just a few examples of pattern blocks here where I can use those to understand shapes. Now, I'll often use these for shapes, even though they do have a 3-dimensionality to them. We will still often use this to identify a triangle, a trapezoid, and so on. But these are really nice, and they're good early tools for helping students recognize, well, what are the different shapes? And here they could put like shapes together. So here I see I've got 2 hexagons. Oh, I've got a 3rd hexagon. I have some squares and rectangles, all rectangles, and then I have a circle. And here, do these shapes fit in anywhere? No, I don't have any other triangles or trapezoids, so I'll go ahead and sort them on their own. Now that's just one manipulative that we can use to help students think about shapes. And I'm going to scoot those to the side right now, because then I want to show another manipulative that's really helpful for shapes. These are the angle legs or ang legs. I'm not always exactly sure how to say that, but these are little plastic rods that students can pin together to make different shapes. So for example, maybe you want to see if your students can make a triangle. Well, a triangle would involve 3 line segments. Let me see if I can make a triangle here. Try to make it, I'll make it with my yellow line segment. And I can pin these together, just as you see here, to create a triangle. That is a shape that has 3 sides, and then it's created 3 angles, 1, 2, 3. The nice thing about this is that students can create lots of different triangles. So it's not always a green triangle that's equilateral, but maybe sometimes I make an orange triangle that is equilateral, or maybe sometimes I make just any other triangle that I'd like to make. Here, maybe if I pin these together, now I've got a triangle like this that has, again, 3 line segments, 3 sides, and then it's created 3 angles. Now I made triangles there, but we could make rectangles and pentagons and octagons and so on. And a nice thing with these angle legs is you could make shapes that are regular shapes, but you could also make shapes that are irregular shapes. I could give one example of that. Maybe I want to make a pentagon, and a lot of times students would use 5 line segments that are all the same length or same color, but I could also make a pentagon like this. All right, remember, a pentagon is a 5-sided shape, and I'll move mine to the side so you can see it. And there I just made a 5-sided shape. Is it a regular one? No, but it still is a pentagon because I have 5 sides that created 5 angles. So those are some things that we might want to consider doing with our 2-dimensional shapes. I'm going to move my shapes out of the way here because we also want to talk about those 3-dimensional figures. So there's a lot of really good manipulatives out there that can help students explore 3-dimensional figures. For example, here I have this cylinder. Maybe I also see that in its foam version right there. Maybe I see it in another clear version, just like that. So students can touch and move these, and they can really see the 3 dimensions that are involved in these figures. Here, maybe if I'm talking about pyramids, I could show this shape to students. I'll kind of flip it on its side so you can see it. Here's another version of that. This version of that shape has a plastic net that's inside that we can unpack to see, well, what might the net look like for this. This is a square pyramid. And then I can fold it back up, and I can put it in its little plastic home and leave it there just like that. Here's an example of one of those shapes with a net inside. Here I've got a hexagonal prism, and I'm blocking on the names. Here I've got, and it looks down here, a rectangular prism. So I can show that. I could pull the net out there. And there's just a lot of different manipulatives that I could use. Here's one more that I've got. I've got this nice blue cube here, super big. And you probably won't be able to see the whole thing to the side, but I can touch and move this to help me understand those 3-dimensional figures. Now this is just a sampling of some of the manipulatives that you might want to use to help students understand and identify shapes and figures. So many things. Also, there's a lot of real world things that you can get your hands on, like boxes and cylinders. You can probably find a lot of those things in your kitchen or in your school. So the more that students have an opportunity to practice with real hands-on manipulatives, the more it might help them really understand what these shapes and figures are all about. So that brings us to activity 1. Here we're going to do an activity where I'd like you to think about the diverse learners in your classroom. You get to interpret diversity, but maybe you think about linguistic diversity, or maybe you think about students who have disabilities. And I'd like you to look at all of these standards related to identification of shapes across grades pre-K through 2. And then think about how might you differentiate some of your activities for those diverse learners if you are addressing each of these sets of standards.